All right, it looks like we're live. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this first NAEA Peer-to-Peer Hangout of the year. My name is Chelsea Kelly, and I'm the manager of digital learning at the Milwaukee Art Museum, and I'm also part of the National Art Education NAEA Peer-to-Peer Initiative, which began as a way for us to engage with topics of discussion and ideas outside of the national convention once a year. So we're so thrilled that all of you are here today for our first Hangout of the year, Embracing a Digital Mindset in Museums. I just do want to start by saying this is the first of a series of Hangouts that will happen every second Wednesday of the month, so they're monthly this year, and we're excited to kick this one off with talking about museum tech and digital. So just a few housekeeping notes. This event is being recorded, and it will be posted on the NAEA Museum Ed page after the Hangout ends. And then we also welcome you to, as we start talking, use the Q&A app to post any questions for us to kind of keep the conversation going. And you should be able to see the Q&A as an option on the left-hand side if you're viewing through Google+. So to get us started, we are thrilled to have with us today a number of folks in the field who are both museum educators and museum technologists, and who think about the topic of embracing a digital mindset in museums quite a bit. And this Hangout was inspired by a number of recent articles that have been written about that topic, particularly in the Code Words series, which Ed will talk more about shortly. But today we brought together authors of those articles, as you can see, to talk more about what they've written and expand the conversation. So we'll start by some brief introductions, and then Mike is going to kick us off. So Mike, do you want to start with introductions?
Sure, yeah, I'll start. So I'm Mike Murawski. I am the Director of Education and Public Programs at the Portland Art Museum in Portland, Oregon. And just briefly, the article that I had, or the essay that I had written as part of the Code Words project, which Ed can talk about in terms of this online discourse group, was really about this embracing a digital mindset and thinking about digital, not just about digital technologies, but how we can think about the way that museums work and our own practice differently in the digital age.
Great, thank you, Mike. Ed, do you want to go next?
Sure. My name is Ed Rodley. I'm the Associate Director of Integrated Media at the Peabody Essex Museum. I'm also on the Board of Directors of the Museum Computer Network. And as Mike said, together with a couple of colleagues of mine, Rob Stein from the Dallas Museum of Art and Suze Cairns from the Baltimore Museum of Art, we launched a little online publishing experiment we called Code Words, which was specifically designed to do many of the same things that we're doing today, actually, is trying to figure out how to stimulate online discourse in a less regimented, a less formal way than conference sessions, getting together once a year to talk about what's going on, writing articles that might take months or years to actually find their way into print, and try to see what the differences are nowadays in terms of the ways that we as professionals can communicate with each other. And so I wrote, my contribution to that collection was something called The Virtues of Promiscuity, which is looking at the difference between the way digital assets work in the world nowadays versus the way physical assets used to work in the past, and how living in a culture where you're just awash in these digital assets requires us as museums to think differently about the way that we take care of information and how we do or don't let people interact with it.
Great, thank you, Ed. And I'll jump in and briefly mention my article. Again, I'm Chelsea from the Milwaukee Art Museum, and I posted an article on artmuseumteaching.com, which is a forum blog that Mike runs, about an experience I had at a workshop at the Meta Lab at Harvard about open collections data and telling stories with data. And the big idea behind my article was really to connect the big ideas that drive the open collections movement, which is about how museums can open up their collections data to anyone who might want to grapple with and play with that data to tell stories with data. The big ideas of that movement being access, participation, sharing, play, and experimentation, how those ideas can apply not only to the digital realm, but also what happens physically in our galleries with engagement with art and museums, and as a kind of mental state of openness that we can encourage in staff and visitors, and that it can also be an impetus for us to talk cross-departmentally, as we're doing today, about these kinds of endeavors. Michelle, do you want to go next?
Sure. So I did not write an article for today, but I'm very excited to be here. So I'm Michelle Grohe. I'm the Director of School and Teacher Programs at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston, and I'm also a member of the NAEA Museum Education Division Development Committee. So I represent the Eastern region, and one of the people that, along with Chelsea, that started the Peer2Peer initiative. So always happy to be a part of the Hangouts, and our museum is in the process of going through different types of planning, and I'm on the digital task force where we're thinking about digital and its role here at the museum. So it was very interesting to read the articles and hear more from the authors and have a conversation.
Excellent, thank you. And I want to give a call out to Julene, who's our tech lead today. Julene, do you want to briefly introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Julene Chevalier, and I'm the Curator of Education at the National Museum of Art, and along with Michelle and Chelsea are part of the Peer2Peer committee, and I'm also on the Development Committee for the NAEA Museum Education Division. So welcome everybody, and I will help facilitate questions. In case you didn't know, if you mouse around your screen, you should see a bar of options on the left side of your screen. If you click on Q&A, you should have a place on the right side of your screen to type in questions. So we hope you'll do that throughout. You can also express your interest in a question by clicking on the +1 or +2, however many likes it gets. Then we can tell that that's something that a lot of people are interested in. So we hope you interact with us, because that's what this medium is for. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, Julene. And Mike, I will turn it over to you to get us started.
Cool. Thanks, Chelsea. And I should, I think it's important to sort of note the format that we're using, and Ed sort of mentioned it because of the importance of digital discussions and online ways of communicating with professionals and with the larger audience out there. And so just thanks to the NAEA for doing, Michelle, Julene, Chelsea, and everybody for doing these peer-to-peer hangouts. I think it's been fantastic, and pretty much all of us that are on this today represent, we're blogging, we're online, we're connecting with either teachers or our own colleagues and peers online. It's becoming a really, really important way to be connecting with professionals and pushing the field forward in a much more immediate way. So just to mention that. I don't know if that's my soapbox or not, but so yeah, I thought I would just start out with some of my own thinking when I wrote my piece, and it took a long time to kind of come up with the final text for that, and I appreciated the Code Words project because it forced me to write something, but then there was a really great editing process, and then now anybody can go on and publicly comment or question any of those things, and then it gets folded into this process, which is something you can do online that you can't do with a journal article, and I appreciate that. And so it made me think and reflect a lot on what questions do I have for technology, and sort of, why are we thinking about this? How much should we think about it? I think it's become really important to me and to the field for us to be thinking about the necessity of digital museum practice and engaging digital ways of thinking into the work that we do. It doesn't take too many Judith Dobrinsky articles for us to know that new forms of audience engagement and digital engagement are being questioned and challenged as museums are pushing forward in this field. We're being criticized for being trendy, pandering to young audiences through social media projects. We're constantly charged for being disconnected with the art, and I think even disconnected with each other. So technology is innately not something that connects people, but that it's something that I think it's that stereotype of the teenager with headphones on, walking down the sidewalk, not thinking about anything except for whatever they're connecting to on their iPod or something, and I think that stereotype of technology is just so untrue and not really based on much of the reality of the digital age these days. So it has led me, and I think a lot of us, to think about how much time should we be spending thinking about digital technologies? Are we spending too much time thinking about these types of projects, or are we spending too much resources? And so through just my own thinking process, I think the answer for me was just no. We need to be spending a lot of time thinking about the impact of digital technologies on society, on culture, and on how museums can continue to stay relevant within that dynamic. And some of the things that I was thinking about, and I've presented a couple times on this too, with audiences that are not particularly technologists, and I'm not technology. I'm a digital native in terms of my profession, but not a technologist really. More of an education side of things. So I surf the boundaries there. I think we can talk a little bit about that. But with 3 billion people around the world having access to the internet, almost 9 out of 10 people in this country have access to the internet, 700 million smartphones. I think I read that people upload 10,000 hours of video onto YouTube every day. So there's more than a year of straight video uploaded to YouTube every day. Speaking of blogs, there's 133 million, probably more than that now, 133 million blogs. 560 million people use Twitter, and more interestingly for me, Twitter users are searching 1.6 billion times per day. So they're not just sharing what they had for breakfast in the morning, which is the stereotype of the people sharing random things on Twitter. They're actively searching for information through these social media tools. With 1 billion Facebook users, I think there's 2.5 billion pieces of content shared every day. So this dynamic of sharing, connecting, learning, playing, questioning, socializing, communicating, people are doing all those things so differently these days, and for museums to see an engagement with that as trendy or pandering to young, teenage audiences or millennials is misguided. So I think trying to push beyond that and acknowledge that this is a major shift in the way that people are engaging with, everything, but certainly cultural institutions. And how do we start to respond more to that? How do we exist? How do museums exist differently in a world where you can stand in front of a painting and you can access 350,000 bits of information. You can access videos, you can access all kinds of content. There's other visitor responses, there's blog posts about it. I mean, it's amazing if you actually stand in front of a painting and Google it, how much is out there. And then it starts to get museums to rethink about the role they probably had 100 years ago, maybe even 30 years ago, which is the holder of all that knowledge and that authority. And so a lot of it is just rethinking not just the digital projects that we have, but rethinking everything. Digital is everything. Digital is everywhere. And so even when we're doing non-digital projects, I think it's how do we connect to all of these types of mindsets, of ways of working that will embrace all of these things in the practice that we have. So a little bit of a setup on that. Maybe I can toss it out to you guys and we can pick up the conversation from there.
Yeah, I can jump in. I think one of the things that I really appreciated that made me think differently about your article, Mike, was really viewing it as almost a behavioral change rather than a trend. Because when you put it that way, it really does put that kind of idea of participation and sharing and a new way of communicating into a more inclusive context, I think. It's less about a certain age group and more about a way that the world is learning to communicate in new and different ways. And I think that almost legitimizes the need for us as cultural institutions to think more about how we can play a role in that communication, not just ride the wave of the communication, but through these initiatives like open collections really lead the way and pave the way for how our institutions can embrace, to use your word, this kind of thinking rather than just follow along on the tail end.
And to follow up on that, I think as someone who's been working in museums for a while now, one of the things that I find most interesting, particularly where we're talking about museums' relationships with digital technologies, most of the interests that people have in them nowadays really have little to do with the technologies themselves per se, and have much more to do with the social implications of them. So, your example, Chelsea, of open collections and the whole open glam movement, none of that stuff is technically challenging. There's nothing new or novel about sharing information or working with Wikipedia. It's been around for a while. Museums have been digitizing content for an incredibly long time. The only thing that's shifted really has been the mindset of this being what was once inconceivable is now very conceivable, and in fact, people are starting to do things in different ways very publicly. So we have this interesting tension going on right now between the people who like things to be the way they were, and they're comfortable that way, and why can't we just be the way we've always been? And the other part of the world who's busy being different now because technology allows you to do these things differently. And this pull that we're feeling now between, having people on one side saying we need to be more open and people on the other side saying don't change anything, has very, very little to do with the actual stuff. Whereas in years past, even like 10 years ago, much more of the technology conversation actually focused on technologies. If you go even to the museum technology conferences like Museums in the Web or MCN, you'll find very few sessions where people are explicitly focusing on whatever the new shiny thing is. It nowadays seems to be much more focused on our response to that technology, which is, I think, where we should be.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to talk about that. And something that I was really interested in thinking about was how we can view that as an opportunity to have those conversations, because when it isn't about the complicated technology or the hardware or this scary, touchscreen thing that I'm not sure how to use, it becomes about this overall idea, which even though the vocabularies and the languages that we use to talk about it in different departments or areas of institutions varies, a lot of the big ideas and what we want out of them ultimately are the same. So it's, hopefully we can use it as this opportunity to get on the same page and move forward. And, it comes from fear too. Change can be really scary, and a lot of this does imply that change is coming, but it's also, as you were saying, Ed, really aligned with what we've done for many years as institutions, and often really aligned with our overall missions as places of education. And I think I'm gonna maybe turn to a question, because we have one that has gotten a lot of upvotes. So Julian, I'm going to turn to the question from Peggy. I'll read it out loud. Maybe museums are accused of pandering because many current projects seem somewhat superficial. What are some examples of digital projects that really allow/encourage people to engage with art in deep and imaginative ways? So I'll throw it out to the group.
Yeah, I can jump in a little bit, but I'm sure everyone else will have thoughts too. It's a really good question. And especially coming from Peggy at an institution where they're thinking about all these things. Michelle knows that more than anybody else does. I think when I hear questions like that, which are really common, I think not every digital project is embracing a digital mindset. And it's something that the language makes it complicated to talk about. So I think throughout this process, I've been trying to figure out how do we talk about these things in a clear language that everyone kind of knows what we're talking about. So I don't think we're quite there yet, but there are definitely digital projects out there that don't really connect people, that don't really open to participation, don't help us rethink authority. And I think the projects that I feel are more successful either in connecting with art or simply bringing, using a museum as a space to bring people together, to share, to connect in new ways with these cultural institutions. It's ones that are defining their goals, that really connect with these things that we're talking about in terms of openness, participation, and rethinking the museum's position within, culture. And I think, and then if a digital project emerges from that, is going to be better, but I think if it's just the goal is we need to do a social media project. So let's see, we have a Titian painting coming up. So let's do social media with Titian. We'll have someone tweet the Titian, or we'll have, then it does become sometimes superficial and seem like we're just trying to use social media but the goals aren't really based out of the digital mindset. And so I think oftentimes the really good digital projects have strong analog components. So one of the questions that I asked, got over a year, about almost 2 years ago, when I was at the Museum of Contemporary Art in San Diego presenting about technology was, if the power went out in your museum, how would that change the visitor learning experience and visitor engagement with your museum? And it was at the time when the Gallery One project in Cleveland had just launched, and I think I was freaking out, thinking, oh my God, if I was at that museum and we literally lost power for I think Hurricane Sandy had happened too, not too distant from that. If you lose power and you have a 40-foot micro-tile multi-touch screen, and that goes down, do you have an extremely compelling visitor experience that is participatory, connected, based in sharing, and based in this digital mindset? Or do you have to put a sign up that says, sorry, come back later? And actually, I think the Cleveland Museum does provide a rich, robust experience beyond just flashy technology. And so I'm not really in critique of them much anymore. But I think that's when digital projects are really good, you can unplug them and people are like, oh, that's okay. We still have so many ways to connect, learn, share, and really own these projects. I mentioned, not to be sort of shameful in, promoting our own projects, but the Capture Parklandia project that did get a lot of criticism this past summer was one that had so many components to it and a lot of community ownership to it that I'm proud of that project and the staff here, Kristen Vans and Justin Meyer and everybody that worked on that. Another project that I brought up in the piece that I wrote was this project that I've been only digitally involved with, but Chelsea, you guys have had it on view. I can't remember there's like dozens of museums that have done that Question Bridge project, it's created by artists, and so it's thinking about art and artistic practice a little differently than is it connecting people with something in your collection. But to me, it was a good example of museums getting out of the way and allowing community engagement to happen through this artistic project, through this artistic practice in a really successful way that has connected people regardless of boundaries, and it really connects African American males through this really authentic questioning and answer strategy. So just some examples of projects that I think blow way past the superficial and I think exist in powerful ways even when you unplug them.
So, Mike, one of the things that comes to mind when you talk about projects like that is or a big issue that's coming up, I think, from all three of your articles is how do you measure success, or because I think a lot of museum educators, we have our own way of defining that or grasping what success looks like when we're in person or engaging with folks, or perhaps you have a survey that you send out afterwards. So I'm wondering if any of you could address how you actually measure success for some of the projects that you've worked on, because I think sometimes it's an elusive component to some of this work for museum educators, at least. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh, everyone's really thinking about that one. Okay.
I can maybe jump in here, unless Ed.
It's a tough one to answer.
Yes.
I can jump in with one example, and it's a pretty specific one because, to Mike's point, this project is very much both analog and digital. My teen program, we have a grant that lets us have one-to-one iPads for each student to use while they're at the museum, and for their final project, they're tasked with creating some sort of a media project. Last year it was videos that would go onto our YouTube page about works of art in the collection. And for us, what ended up showing success was less like the number of hits it's getting on YouTube or how it's made the rounds on social media or in newsletters or anything like that, and more about the participants, the teens themselves. So I looked at their videos as evidence for how they'd grown in their thinking about museums and art, and how museums and art could help them become more reflective. So I think that actually goes along kind of nicely with what Mike was saying, because I wonder, Mike, if that Parklandia project, that one of the measures of success for that seems to have been that community involvement and community organization. So, for me in that specific instance with my teens, the being on public on YouTube was awesome, was a plus, but it wasn't the driver for why we did it. Technology was the right tool to make their thoughts known on a greater field so that they felt like their words and thoughts were meaningful, and help them kind of get to that point of being reflective about what they were saying. Good question. Maybe I'll add just to that, since we're still on the Peggy's question, I wanted to add on that note that I think it's important to view that technology as a tool, and sometimes it becomes a smaller part of a program or a bigger part of a program. With the teens, it was the right tool to use. With Gallery 1, there are some really amazing things that happen in that space because of the technology, and for me, I think it's impressive that you look at the works of art differently because of some of the interactives that they have. So for me, that would be another measure that I'd think about using. Are you looking at the work of art in a new way thanks to that that technology?
Yeah, and that was, I guess, a part too I was thinking about too, is if the measures of success are similar or parallel those that we do with on-site interactions or programming as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think for just quickly, because I know we have a lot of questions, and that's fantastic that we do. I think Michelle, it's a great question, because I think we're figuring this out as we, make these changes and embrace these projects that might not only be digital, because I think we're getting ways to reflect on digital practice, and we have these instruments and tools that in some cases have been refined for a long time to think about, gallery learning practice. And I think what we haven't done, and it was something that in preparation for this that came up while we were just doing our tech test, which is this way that we're surfing between museum ed and museum tech. And how, those are gray areas, they blend together in nice ways. I think all of us now, represent kind of the museum ed / museum tech, overlap. But I think we need to have more conversations about, how we can sort of measure, evaluate, and define success projects like this. That aren't purely reliant on social media analytics and things like that. Because that's where I get nervous when we focus too much on those things, because it's like, well, I would never use that to measure the success of a gallery learning experience that I was having with people. But I think there's a lot to learn. Museum technology has a lot to learn from museum education, and then vice versa. So to have more conversations like that would be really excellent. Like we're having.
Just to follow up on Mike's point, and to get back to Peggy's original question about some of the projects that we get beat up about seeming kind of superficial. One of the things that I always try to do when looking at those things is just remove the word digital anywhere and see if it still makes sense. Because oftentimes we tend to get hung up on this analog-digital dichotomy that may or may not really exist. So there are probably plenty of projects out there that are not digital projects that don't have clear goals, which makes them hard to measure whether they're successful or not. There are certainly digital projects out there that suffer the same fate. But the digital nature of it shouldn't get in the way of trying to assess these things as museum programs. So to some extent, sometimes we need to use different ways to measure them when you're dealing with remote audiences, but when it comes right down to it, I would say that a lot of the current crop of museum digital projects out there have more in common with traditional programming than differences from them. The kinds of things we're trying to get people to do are more like things that people have done in museums and galleries in the past, and personally, I'm not that interested in plumbing the depths of the digital-physical divide much anymore. I think it's much more important for us to come up with a shared body of knowledge of what constitutes success, which is why conversations like this, I think, are so important. And this notion of not replicating what I think people would generally problematize as how siloed museum work is. You exist in the education silo or the exhibition silo or the technology silo, which doesn't really map well to the way that the world works in the 21st century. So trying to resist whenever possible attempts to have your projects or yourself crammed into an appropriate pigeonhole is something I think we all need to be working on.
One thing I think that connects all of those together is that overlap of museums, of tech and teaching and education is Zoe's question. I'm going to pull that up. So it's, do you see a need for museums to teach visitors, users?
Can I jump in with one of the questions that's popping up on the side? Oh, there.
Yeah, Julian, I think your volume was just down a little bit, so you were reading the next question.
Sorry, I didn't hear. Yeah.
That's okay. I'll read it. I think my audio is working okay. The question is from Zoe. Do you see a need for museums to teach visitors/users how to use emerging technologies? It seems that tech might bring up some complicated issues around legibility and access if museums are striving to be super cutting edge.
Me.
Ed.
I'd love to tackle that one.
Go for it.
I think that's a great conversation to have with the rest of the staff of your museum, because for some museums the answer will probably be no. That's not what they're about. And for other museums, I don't think that's a question that can have only one answer, but I think having that conversation around these kinds of issues is something that would be incredibly rewarding for pretty much the staff of any museum. What do you want the museum's relationship to be with these new technologies? Because you could spend all of your time talking about whatever the latest thing is, and the next latest thing is, right around the corner waiting to displace it. So figuring out for yourselves what that right answer is, I think, is a perfectly valuable way to spend some time.
And I'd add that I think it's important to remember that we should probably be providing a wide range of experiences. So I doubt that even the most cutting-edge museum would necessarily be saying it's just tech, it's just the super cutting-edge technology. I think there's an important consensus that's slowly building around providing different types of experiences, and that's been around for a long time with visitor motivation theory, John Falk and Lynn Jerking, about visitors coming for different reasons. So it's almost less about, to me it seems like tech is sometimes the tool that helps fulfill those motivations for the visits, but it's not always the right tool. So if super cutting edge tech is the right thing, go for it. But if it's not, that's okay too. And I think I've done that a lot in projects here at my museum. We have an interactive lab that has a huge touch screen that you can view different conservation techniques on. Wouldn't have been successful without a touch screen because you wouldn't be able to view these different kinds of lenses. But in the same room, we have a completely analog Ask a Curator style station that's actually a lot more effective because we have the curators handwrite responses rather than building some complicated submission system on a computer, which you could do, but it just wasn't the right tool and wasn't as intimate in the end. So I think it's about that kind of thinking about from the visitor-centered or user-centered mind frame and choosing the right tool for the goal that you're trying to reach.
Yeah, one little quick chime in on that's a great question about do museums need to teach visitors technology? I think one of the things that comes up, and it came out recently when I was looking again at the digital engagement framework documents that Jasper Visser and Jim Richardson have come out, that a lot of museums, not just art museums, but a lot of other museums are using to think about the digital experience with visitors. Is that part of the process? It can be museums teaching their internal staff about technology, so doing internal technology trainings to develop a more technology-savvy institution, not so that you can have more staff able to go out on the floor and facilitate technology experience with the visitors, but just so that when we talk about the importance of social media, it's not, I don't care how many people have Twitter accounts, but it's when people just write off Twitter like, oh, it's just something that 20-somethings are doing, which isn't true. But I think Twitter has been connected to political revolutions around the world. I think the Ferguson events happening in St. Louis, the protest movement on Twitter has been powerful and engaging. And if people can connect to technology and gain a greater awareness within institutions, then we can develop a stronger mindset, a stronger way of working. And so I think maybe less about training it frightens me to think about training people, like visitors, to use technology, which is why I think, along the lines of what Ed has been saying and what all of us have been saying, that remove the word digital or unplug. Come into the museum when all the lights are off and find out, how your project's working when the screens aren't working, and having those digital, so that we have Capture Parklandia kind of, started out a little bit as kind of an Instagram project to a certain extent. So we started referring it to that, like, hey, this is this Instagram project we're doing. It was so much more than that, and so we started to quickly realize that when we called it that, it limited it. So we had to open up the way we were talking about it in terms of, this broader sort of public engagement project around Portland parks and spaces here in Portland, and then people would be like, oh, I can participate. Great. I don't need to learn how to use Instagram to participate in the project that you guys have. And so that's been, I think, important too. We don't need to train our visitors on technology if we're embracing a digital mindset. Because as I think so many of the quotes that I loved and tried to put as many of them in my essay as I could, it's not about digital technologies. It's not solely about digital technologies.
It's about people.
Yeah.
I'm going to move. We have a bunch more questions, which is great. I think I'm going to move us on to Kathleen's question. So her question is, are we limiting ourselves to considering only museum-created digital projects? I'd like the panel to describe the most compelling, informative, and impactful experience they've had digitally, period. Then think of how it could translate to museum practice. I love this question.
Awesome question.
Yeah,
That's
and
awesome.
actually, side note to what Mike was just saying, we internally do a lot of think tanks to bring staff together around these bigger kind of digitally related projects, and we've started with this question with staff, so it's a good one. Does anybody want to begin?
I'll take a whack at it.
Go for it.
The short answer, yes. It's something we do all the time. We tend to think of the world as the museum world, when in fact we are a very, 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 very small niche audience and market in the global scheme of things, particularly around digital stuff. Since it is still relatively expensive compared to other things, there are lots of other people out there doing really incredible stuff online that it behooves us to pay closer attention to than we do. We all choose to work in museums and think they are the grandest places on earth you could possibly be. But there are people who are doing interesting things. I think particularly for me and the work that I'm interested in, some of the examples of online storytelling that people are doing. The National Film Board of Canada has done some incredible, I don't even know what I would call them. I guess transmedia experiences is the way they generally tend to get described, but things like Bear 71, which is this non-linear narrative allowing you to track the movements of a particular bear in the Canadian wilderness, and you get to basically relive this bear's life story as you follow it across the landscape, and there are video and audio and still images, and you can view it chronologically, you can go back and forth, you can look at it geologically. It's an interesting way of looking at a story. What is the life story of this bear? And allowing you to have as many entry points as you could possibly want. And it's for me, I think one of the signs of success is that the second or third time I go back to it, it still gives me something that I didn't already have. So I think models like that have a great deal of relevance for what we're trying to do, since we do have so many of these kinds of really deep, compelling narratives with lots of content to back them up. And we certainly, I think, aspire to provide as many access points to the stories that we hold as possible. Another more probably widely known one would be the New York Times Snowfall article that came out, God, when was that, 3 years ago? 4 years ago? The idea of being able to use the web as something that you could do long-form journalism on at the time seemed kind of revolutionary. But their ability to mix different kinds of media and still tell one very compelling story, and again give you multiple ways to access it, I think is something that I don't think I've seen museums really manage to step up to yet. Partly that's We struggle for resources, probably more than the New York Times does, but there are a lot of examples of things going on out in the wider world that I think are probably, truth be told, more interesting than a lot of the stuff that's happening in the sector, particularly when it comes to digital stuff, just because we are conservative institutions. We tend to take a good long time deciding when we're going to leap into something new, so that gives us plenty of time to look and see what the other people who've already jumped in have done. It's a good opportunity.
Ed, are you suggesting that museums aren't doing the most interesting work in the entire world right now?
I would never, ever, ever suggest that on something that's being captured to posterity. We do tend to have a longer-term view of things. I mean, in my current job, a lot of the people I talk to are people who are in the digital field, where like 6 months is a long time for these people. Forget about like 10-year plans, 20-year plans. Like, what's the museum going to look like in the next century? Our time frames are just so different that it colors the way you work. When I talk to people about, we're still going to be using your product after you go out of business. So we're really concerned at what the plan is for what we're going to do to get stuff out of your program long after you guys are gone, because we're still going to be here. It's not an insurmountable barrier, but it is a definite culture shift that you need to be aware of. So yes, we are conservative, and that's a good thing.
Well, I can really quickly sort of answer. It's a great question to think about non-museum-based digital projects, and it kind of dovetails some of the stuff Ed was talking about in terms of digital storytelling, because he and I and many other people out there are just thinking a lot about projects that we have that involve storytelling, community storytelling, and how to use technology to support that. One of the things that I can't seem to break myself away from right now is the podcast that is a spin-off of This American Life, the Serial podcast that Sarah Koenig is doing right now. I think it has been the #1 iTunes podcast now for several weeks. More than 1 million people are downloading it every week, and it's kind of using really compelling storytelling, but also using this radio format that is really coming back. People's listening of podcasts has exploded again recently. People are willing to spend 20 or 30 minutes listening to a compelling storytelling. And I'll use that word compelling because not all museum storytelling is compelling. In fact, sometimes we're not so good at that, even though we have incredible stories and incredible ways that people are connecting with objects and collections and experiences within the museum. And these objects have some really incredible stories behind them if you peel them open and spend the time, I think, to tell those stories. And so I think there's things that I'd love to see museums experiment more with radio and, like Ed said, some of this more long-form things. I think this idea of 90 seconds or a minute or something being the most content that people can digest is maybe one of the bad side effects of embracing with Twitter and text messaging and technology is the brevity of it. But what we're learning out of a lot of other things is that people are willing to read through. I mean, actually, the Code Words project is interesting because it's more long form, even though they're still like blog posts. Some of those are 20 to 30 minute reads, and thousands of people are sitting there and reading them. So I think it's interesting that people are willing to spend time when they're reading through something or checking through something that's really compelling. So just another side, non-museum project that I think we can learn a lot from.
And I'd add to that, one immediate thought would be that I think we need to keep in mind where people are consuming those long-form content pieces. That's not in the galleries, right? Like there's no museum that has enough chairs and couches comfortable enough to have someone listen to a 20-minute even if it's super compelling podcast, kind of a deal, or read, So I think that's a good thing to keep in mind about like the 90-second rule maybe still applies when you're physically in the gallery unless you're like creating a lounge with artwork in it. I don't know, maybe that's a crazy thought, but I'd also add with Serial, I think one of the reasons it's making such a splash also is that it totally turns journalism on its head, because it's not even journalists, usually it's you get the finished piece with all the research and all the thought process already finished and complete and wrapped up, and that's what you listen to, even with long-form podcasts. But what's so cool about Serial is that we discover along with her, and I think that kind of dovetails with maybe a lower line trend that I've been seeing in museums about being more transparent and letting people into the behind-the-scenes working of museums to not only make museums more accessible and friendly and meet staff, but I think there's this desire with all this information at the tips of our fingers to really figure out, how do we sort through that information? Like, what goes on that gets the art mysteriously on the walls? So maybe there's something there with Serial that could inspire some curators to share their research sooner than later along the way. That would be really cool. I'm going to maybe move us along because we've got a lot of questions and not as much time left. I'll go on to Neil's question next. Neil is a fellow Beautiful Data participant. His question is, what are the risks of museums resisting or ignoring the importance of the digital mindset?
Where to begin?
Truth.
I would love to have a couple of beers with Neil and talk about this. I'm sure we'd find a lot in common. I think for me the big risk I see at the moment is we're in this phase of having this existential debate about how do museums remain relevant, which I think we've been having pretty much for at least the last 30 years as different technologies have come along. Resisting or ignoring the importance of, so what do we mean when we talk about the digital mindset? I think is a good place to start answering this question. For me, I would say that mindset is one that is collaborative, it's open, it's transparent, it's one that privileges iteration over finish, and I think sticking with the, say, 19th century model, which most of our museums are built on, of silos, the privileging of polish over pretty much anything else, the more theater-based mindset of it's all about getting to opening night, and however many people you have to kill or eggs you have to break, as long as the show opens and looks perfect on opening night, then it's a success. I don't think is going to continue to serve us well in the 21st century. So, one way to, I think the best way to remain relevant is to be relevant, and to be relevant means being in the world that we are supposedly serving. And the more and more the world is becoming a place that is designed to freely share digital information, is one where collaboration and this kind of social media style contact is the norm. The more and more we are less like that, the harder and harder it becomes, I think, for more and more people to find us relevant. That's just me, though.
Yeah, I would add on to that, reiterate all of that, and even go as far as to say that I think museums are being irresponsible if they're ignoring, not just digital mindset, because that kind of narrows it down even maybe a little too much, but if museums are ignoring the fact that their role that our role in the knowledge ecosystem, has shifted, it is shifting, and if museums are gonna, I've heard museum directors out there over the last couple of years iterate ideas like, well, we're going to weather the storm. As long as we kind of hunker down, we have our authority, we have our knowledge, we have our collections, we'll make it through this digital trend and come out the other side. But I mean, now with major institutions, it's not these little small risk-taking institutions that are engaging with this. It's major institutions that are dedicating enormous amounts of resources to be transforming their institutions. But I just don't understand how museums can be thinking in the future about, like Ed said, we can't use these 19th century models anymore of the role that museums play within culture, and the fact that we're knowledge holders is changing so much. So I think there's tremendous risk in ignoring that.
Well, and to follow up on that, a couple of years ago, I think it was Rob Stein gave a wonderful presentation at a conference I was at in London, where he talked about this mindset, which is sort of a late 20th century one, of the bridge to the future. And the idea that the current state of flux is something that is finite and will end and will result in a new equilibrium used to hold true, I think. We used to be able to say, all right, well, we're just going to, this whole iPod thing, whatever, we're going to wait 3 years and see what happens. And you could kind of do that, but I think we have gotten to the point, and the point Rob made, which really stuck with me, was that the way the world seems to be going now, there is no other side. It's pretty much all bridge. So if you're going to wait for things to settle down, you're going to wind up waiting a very, very long time. And it may never happen. So being comfortable living in that kind of weird in-between state where you don't know what the future is going to look like. You have the technologies and the capacities you have at hand, and you've got an uncertain future, and you need to figure out how you're going to make your way, not knowing what the next thing is, other than knowing there will be a next thing. It will probably be incredibly disruptive, and you'll have to figure it out all over again.
And I'd add to that, too, I think another big idea that comes out or is part of this digital mindset is ownership. And that's a scary thing because, this 19th century model is very much about trustworthiness, authority. We've got the information, come and get it. But so much of this digital mindset is much more about letting people feel like they have ownership and a stake in the institution. And I think if we ignore the opportunities there, then we miss out on bringing to us and enfolding a huge new generation of museum goers, and not in an age or in an age way, but just in general for folks who feel comfortable thinking this way and who are just naturally thinking this way now. You lose that relevance, and that ownership is so key in allowing museums to take those risks, because if you feel like your visitorship is going to go along with you even when you're taking risks, then you can take that risk. It's a little less scary, but it's also scary to get there because of that change. All right, I'm going to move us on to the next
I think I would problematize
go ahead.
Notion of ownership.
Yeah, go for it.
That's okay. Just are we owners or are we stewards? And that's an important distinction, I think. If you're a steward, your obligations are much more than if you are an owner. And I would say that most of us would probably agree that we are stewards of the things that we have in our collections, even though legally we can say we own a lot of them. But if we're stewards, we have a much higher obligation to be willing to share what we have.
That's a really good delineation, yeah. And I think maybe ownership is probably not the right word, but I think of the students I work with and how before coming into certain programs at the museum, they had no clue that it was a place for them. And now, with a few weeks under their belt of just spending time saying, it's okay, talk in a museum, use an iPad in the museum, do these weird activities in museums where you're, moving around in the space in a new way. They become maybe advocates is a better word. But yeah, that's a good question, is to figure out what that right phrasing is there and setup is to include people, maybe inclusion, advocacy, yeah, something along those lines. Thank you. In the interest of time, I am going to move us on to a next question. Maybe time for one or two more, depending on how long this next one takes. We'll go on to Rebecca's question. What are the best ways to learn about museum tech tools that are out there? Do you want to go ahead?
You're doing it right now. Right?
I agree. Yeah, definitely. And I think for me, I'd add in Twitter. Twitter is a huge way that I've found out about what's going on. The MuseTech hashtag is really great. Just kind of troll around and follow people who are active on there and talking about great stuff. I get a lot of my news and updates in that arena from Twitter. Any other mechanisms you guys use?
I think a lot of it is just also trying different things. Like Chelsea and I were on a group when we were figuring out which platform to use for these type of events, and we tried quite a few and thought about it and reflected about it together, and then tried others that eventually led us to Google Plus Hangout. So not being afraid to try different things out, but also trying things out with colleagues, I think, is also helpful, and not necessarily at your museum if that's not the scenario. But I agree, Twitter is also a great place just to keep informed.
Yeah, and the New Media Consortium comes out every year with the Museum Horizon Report that gives short-term technologies that we're thinking about and trends, kind of mid-term and then long-term, and that's been a way that it's great because it's just links to ways that it's being used, articles that are out there, case studies. It's not like this huge in-depth discussion of each individual one. It's like a link to, it's like hyperlinking to as many things, and that's been really tremendous, especially getting outside of just museum ed or museum technology and getting out into all kinds of other technologies that maybe we're not thinking about immediately.
Great. We have a number of questions that are kind of tied with upvotes. So Mike and Ed or Michelle, if there's any that seem like ones that you might want to tackle, any out there? I can choose one, or if there's any that are salient to you.
Oh, one is the evaluation could easily be another hour's worth of discussion.
Yeah.
How to measure success.
We can have a whole separate hangout on
success. It's hugely important, though. It's hugely important. How do you know you can claim success? It's a lot easier to do in a gallery setting where you can actually see people and you can talk to them and you have much easier access to watching their learning. When you're doing it in this mediated form where you never actually lay eyes on them, how do you do it? One little example, we did a small component for our Turner exhibition where we gave people, we basically prescribed a Turner work of art for them based on their current mood by asking them a series of questions. And the way the thing was designed, we were able to look at not only how many people used the interactive, but how many of them finished it, how many got all the way to the end. And that was a conscious decision with a cost implication attached to it. And that I think is probably the easiest, shortest answer to how do you measure success. You have to actually build it into the project, just like with any other project. And I think it will vary for the kind of project it is. And if you look at some of like Capture Parklandia or other crowdsourced shows like Brooklyn and the Carnegie have done, you can look at lots of ways to generate meaningful numbers that an evaluator could look at and tell you things about your project. Yeah, that's all I have at the moment. But that would be a great longer talk to have than the -2 minutes we have left gives us.
We'll put it on our list for future Hangouts because that's a really great question. And I think it applies to, as we were talking about in the beginning of the conversation, it applies to more than just museum technology endeavors, but also to education and exhibitions, etc. Should I wrap it up, or do you want to try to tackle one more? What do you guys think?
Yeah, well, I had one thing to add to that.
Yeah, go for it, Mike.
Really brief, but then I'm seeing a question over there that I can give like a 10-second remark to. One is that one of the code words essays, the one that Rob Stein wrote, called Museum So What, which I've tried to spread as far and wide as possible. I think it's a phenomenal essay. All the code words essays are good, but that one just really resonated with me, more so than my own, definitely. And I think he talks about rethinking what we're measuring and what we value, and I think some of the metrics that we use to measure the success of these projects need to be rethought, and so he gives a really nice discussion of that. So another shout out to CodeWords, because it's a good through Medium, if people aren't familiar with the Medium.com platform. And then the other question was just about, it was from Lauren, about how do we encourage visitors to feel comfortable using their smartphones in the museum. I think museums just need to learn more internally about and just remove fear about people having cell phones and taking selfies and all that. I think sometimes museums grab a hold of these extremely rare incidences where someone bumps into an object because they're taking a selfie, and then everybody clamors down and is like, no, no photos in the galleries, no cell phones, no, we're a pure experience that should be separate from all of that busy, crazy world. People should be contemplative and quiet, and then we just find ourselves right back in the same place where museums are problematic because we're so separate from everyday life. And so I think this BYOD movement, which the New Media Consortium talked a little bit about and spent some time providing resources, trying to support people to bring their own devices in the museum. It's going to take some time, but it's really worth our investing and having as many programs as possible that encourage people to do something with their phones as part of their natural behavior of visiting museums.
Great. So I can't believe it's already been an hour. I feel as if we've only scratched the surface. And I'm sure you guys all feel the same. But I think what I can say to wrap it up, or attempt to wrap it up, is that this is a very much an ongoing conversation, and I think it might be best to view this Hangout as really just a starting point to explore whatever kind of threads of this conversation might have interested each of you. And then I hope that we can continue this conversation, whether on Twitter, using those hashtags, MuseTech, MuseumEd, on the comments of our articles. A lot of what we talked about today is really related to what we each wrote about. So I think that those comments would be a great place to kind of post up some of these questions and give us some more time to grapple with them some more, because there are a lot remaining that are really great. And rest assured, we've got a lot of topics now on the roster for future Hangouts this year. So by way of wrapping up, I just want to say thank you so much, Mike and Ed, Michelle and Julene, for being here today, starting us off on this conversation of embracing a digital mindset. And I hope that all of you watching will spread around the link to this video to your colleagues, start up some conversations with folks who weren't necessarily here today, but you think might benefit from having a chat with you about some of these topics, and we hope to continue the conversation. So we hope you will join us next month, the second Wednesday of every month, for our next Hangout, and you can find all of the list of this year's Hangouts on our Google Plus page, NAEA Museum Education. So thanks again to all of you, and I think we can wrap it up here. Thanks again, everyone.
All right, thank you, Chelsea.
Thanks, Chelsea. Thanks, Michelle and Julene. And thanks, Ed.
Great, thanks everyone.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye.